Imagine a quiet afternoon. You step into a familiar cafe where the cozy atmosphere and the local patrons create a peaceful picture. You choose your usual spot, sit down, and take a sip of your drink. Everything seems to be unfolding in a very ordinary way, but sometimes life can change in an instant without warning. So what would happen if that lunch was no longer peaceful? Today, our story begins in Charleston, a city famous for its tranquility and long history. Curtis Williams, a 63-year-old man recently retired after many years of military service, is seeking peace in a simple lunch at his favorite cafe. But in another corner of the city, a confrontation is looming. Officer Jack Miller, the area's police chief, with his confident attitude and sense of authority, has just walked in. He doesn't care where anyone is sitting. He simply wants to assert his power. The entire cafe can feel the tension as his footsteps echo loudly on the wooden floor. And you know what? Curtis just wants a normal lunch. But perhaps today that won't be possible. You're probably thinking, what will happen next? Will things unfold as expected? Or will there be an unexpected twist that causes the entire city to take notice? And most importantly, can Curtis remain calm in this tense moment before we continue? Let us know where you're listening to this story from and what time it is. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't look away, because this story will make you think long after it's over. It surely won't end with just one lunch. Curtis Williams walked into his familiar cafe with a calm demeanor, carrying an old briefcase he had been using for many years. This cafe, though not remarkable, has a special quietness that Curtis really loves. It is where he can find solace on those quiet days after retiring from the military. The cafe is simply but elegantly decorated. The scent of toasted bread and melting butter combined with the soft yellow light filtering through the windows makes the space feel warm and inviting. His footsteps echoed on the old wooden floor, causing a few customers inside to look up and greet him. Elise, the young woman who greets guests, smiled warmly when she saw Curtis. "Hello, Mr. Langston. Would you like your usual spot?" Elise asked gently. Curtis nodded slightly and walked over to his usual seat by the window. He took a deep breath, savoring the soft atmosphere of the afternoon. Sitting down, he felt peaceful, as if everything in life had settled after many years of work and war. A bit of sweet tea, a slice of cake, and just like that, the perfect afternoon had arrived. However, this tranquility was soon disrupted. The cafe door opened, and the hurried footsteps of a group of people entered, their steps echoing on the hard wooden floor. The other customers all paused their conversations and turned to look. Their entrance was impossible to ignore. When Curtis looked up, he immediately recognized the leader of the group. Officer Jack Miller, the police chief of the area, was entering. Curtis's eyes narrowed slightly when he saw Miller. The man was no stranger to him, tall with a strong face and a look of arrogance. Miller was like a storm about to hit the cafe. Miller didn't need to look around. He walked straight into the cafe, his cold gaze sweeping over the customers, but there wasn't a greeting or a nod of acknowledgement. His actions suggested he owned the place, as though everyone there should bow down to his presence. Even when he got closer to Curtis, Miller didn't bother acknowledging the calm guest sitting by the window. Instead, he stopped right near Curtis's table and placed a hand on it, as if trying to control the atmosphere in the cafe. Curtis wasn't a man lacking in confidence. He had faced many challenges throughout his military career, from fierce battles to life and death decisions. He was used to the gaze of those in power. But this time it was different. Curtis didn't move, merely lifting his head to look at Miller, saying nothing. His gaze was calm, yet contained an unshakable resolve. Miller stood there towering over him as if to challenge him, but Curtis remained seated unmoving. "This table is mine." Miller spoke, his voice cold yet full of arrogance. "Is it?" Curtis replied, his tone soft without a hint of unease. He simply looked Miller straight in the eyes, unwavering. Miller couldn't understand why this man dared to sit at the table he considered his. He took a step closer to Curtis, his hand pressing firmly on the table, his face darkening as if ready to explode. "Don't you know the rules here?" Miller continued, his anger now completely evident. "This is my table every week. This table isn't for someone like you." Curtis still didn't move, showing no strong reaction. A slight smile appeared on his lips, but his silence only made Miller feel more awkward. The eyes of the other customers began to follow the scene, and although no one spoke, the tension in the air was palpable. "This table doesn't have a nameplate. I'm just a customer, and I'll sit here," Curtis replied, showing no sign of tension. The people in the cafe began to pay more attention, their gazes fixed on the two men. Everyone sensing the growing tension, But Curtis remained remarkably calm, as if his life had grown too accustomed to moments like this. Miller couldn't help but feel the awkwardness in his actions. The more enraged he became, the calmer Curtis seemed. This story wasn't about a pointless argument over a table. It was about power control and how one person could face oppression without being shaken. And in that moment, as the silence stretched on, Curtis realized something important. Not everyone understands the value of silence and composure. This encounter had only just begun, but one thing was undeniable. Curtis was not a man easily subdued. So now, what do you think about this meeting? Will Miller's confidence break? Curtis's calm? Share your thoughts in the comments below this video. The atmosphere in the cafe suddenly grew heavy. Curtis sat there still gently holding his drink, his eyes never leaving Officer Jack Miller, who stood before him. Each word Miller spoke made the space feel more suffocating, as if time had stopped and all that remained was the unavoidable confrontation between the two men. "I've told you this spot is mine." Miller's voice became cold and full of authority, as though he were commanding an army rather than standing in a simple cafe. This wasn't a negotiation or a suggestion, but an order. Curtis didn't show any sign of being flustered. He simply lifted his head, his eyes still locked on Miller, as if he were evaluating every small movement of the officer. Curtis had undoubtedly faced countless challenging situations like this throughout his life. He knew that every action he took now would not only decide the outcome of this confrontation, but also deeply reflect his personal values and his unwavering principles. "I have no reason to move." "Curtis?" replied, his voice calm but resolute. He didn't make a challenge, but neither did he back down. This wasn't a battle over a table, but a stand for his rights. Rights that he held as a citizen, a man who had dedicated his life to his country. Refusing wasn't an impulsive act of defiance or unreasonable protest. Curtis didn't intend to escalate or create a violent confrontation. He simply stood firm in his beliefs, not yielding to oppression or the abuse of power. And in that moment, he made everyone in the cafe reconsider themselves, questioning the silence and passivity they had accepted in their daily lives. The tension between the two men grew more palpable. Miller's hand tightened into a fist, veins bulging on his arm, as he took a step closer to Curtis. The customers around them could feel the heaviness in the air. Some turned away, trying not to witness the confrontation, but the tension had spread throughout the cafe. A few began to realize that this confrontation wasn't just a misunderstanding over a table or a trivial argument. This was a power struggle, a test of respect and human rights. "You don't understand." Miller gritted his teeth, struggling to control his anger. "I'm the police chief here, and I can't let anyone disrespect the rules." He didn't specify which rules, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Miller had begun to use his power to impose his will on others, and that was something Curtis could not accept. Curtis simply stared into Miller's eyes, unhurried. He knew that if he reacted too strongly, the confrontation might worsen. But if he yielded, if he overlooked this disrespect, he wouldn't be true to himself anymore. So Curtis just remained silent, unmoving, with only the steady resolve of a man who had lived through many battles. "Rules?" Curtis asked softly, his tone calm. "Whose rules? Which rules? Can you show me a rule that forces me to yield for such an unclear reason?" Curtis stood up, not to provoke, but simply to assert his respect for himself and what he believed in. Miller stood still for a moment, his eyes flashing with anger. He couldn't tolerate being challenged like this, especially by someone he couldn't control with his authority. Curtis's silence was like a mirror reflecting Miller's insecurity and lack of confidence. He was used to controlling everything around him, but this time he couldn't control the situation. "What can you do?" Miller hissed through clenched teeth, staring at Curtis. "Are you going to defy me?" The people in the cafe began to whisper, exchanging worried glances, and some even discreetly reached for their phones. Everything started unfolding in silence, as if time itself had slowed down. A confrontation between a man and a person in power, yet who would truly hold the power in this moment? All eyes were on the two men, and in that instant, everything felt ambiguous and tense. Curtis didn't rush to respond. He didn't need to prove anything. The gazes of the people around him were enough to show that they understood the answer. And for that reason, he took a step back, standing firm once again. "If you can't answer my question, I'll sit back down and continue my meal," Curtis said gently, without worry or fear. Miller stood there, completely silent, as though searching for an escape. The tension in the air had now become unavoidable. Everything had become clear. This wasn't just a trivial argument over a table. It was a struggle for power, honor, and respect. But Curtis did not back down, and now the story had only just begun. The atmosphere in the cafe was not only tense, but also suffocating, as if every sound had slowed and fragmented. Every movement could mark a turning point in a serious confrontation. Curtis Langston sat firm at his table, unshaken, his eyes never leaving Officer Jack Miller, who stood before him like a fire ready to burst. The police chief, despite his power and arrogance, seemed unable to comprehend why the man in front of him was so calm. Curtis's actions and demeanor had surpassed anything Miller could imagine, challenging the entitlement Miller took for granted. "I warned you," Miller said, his voice threatening, slightly choked by anger. "No one here has the right to break my rules, and clearly you're no exception." Curtis still didn't reply, only slowly lifting his hand to grab his glass of water and take a sip. His gesture was so calm that all eyes in the cafe were drawn to him. How he maintained his composure in such a tense situation was a test of the inner strength of a man who had endured the harshest of challenges in battle. The gazes of the others in the cafe began to glimmer with surprise and respect. It seemed everyone realized that this was not just a confrontation between two men, but a battle between the strength of power and the strength of character. Miller stood there still, gripping his fist tightly, his body tense like a drawn bow. He couldn't accept Curtis's calmness, or resistance without words, but enough to undermine all attempts at intimidation. The surprise left Miller confused. It seemed he had never encountered anyone like this before. Curtis's silence wasn't weakness or acceptance of defeat. It was a display of strength that only those who had been through war could truly understand. Miller, though trying to maintain his dignity, could not control his rising anger. He moved closer, almost as if to assert his power through action. "You're challenging me, aren't you?" Miller growled, his eyes burning with fury. "I won't let anyone disrespect the respect I deserve." Curtis didn't move, showing no change in his expression. Just as he had said earlier, he wasn't looking for a confrontation. He simply sat there unmoving, continuing to stare directly into Miller's eyes, not with fear, but with a sharp gaze like a knife's edge. Miller pushed harder, even raising his voice. "If you don't get up, I'll take action." His voice became sharper, full of threat. However, Curtis only tilted his head slightly, his voice calm as ever. "If you want to do something, then do it." These words weren't lacking in challenge, but they were not full of violence or fear. Curtis was too familiar with threats. His entire life had witnessed countless threats on the battlefield and intense confrontations. And now here he was facing the abuse of power from a police officer in the simplicity of a cafe. The customers in the cafe began to realize they were witnessing a moment to remember. Some had taken out their phones to record surreptitiously, but no one dared to speak. The passivity in the crowd seemed to reflect the silence they had always accepted in similar situations, afraid to resist, afraid to speak up, even though they knew the injustice happening right before them. As Miller continued with his threats, the tension in the air became more palpable. Everything around them started to fade, leaving only the two men, one trying to prove his power through words and actions, the other standing firm, unmoving with no unnecessary words. "You don't understand what's happening here," Curtis said slowly, his voice still calm. "You can threaten me, you can do whatever you want, but I will not yield." "You don't understand this, do you?" His voice remained composed, but each word was a warning. Miller stood still, staring at Curtis, but strangely he no longer dared to move. Each word Curtis spoke was a reminder to him of the difference between the power he held and the true power of the man who had lived a life full of challenges. And in that moment, no one in the cafe spoke a word. They only quietly observed, their gazes full of admiration for Curtis, a man so calm that no one could predict what he would do next. Although the confrontation was not over, it had already begun to reveal a profound truth. Sometimes silence and inner strength are all that's needed to confront injustice. The atmosphere in the cafe remained tense, but Curtis still sat there completely calm, as if he were engaged in a battle that only he understood. Officer Jack Miller stood opposite, still gripping his belt tightly, his face red with anger. The tension seemed to have reached its peak, and everyone in the cafe could feel it. No one dared to even breathe too loudly. Miller began to repeat his warning once more, his voice threatening. "You don't have the right to sit here, don't you understand?" His voice grew sharper, filled with a sense of entitlement, as if no one could challenge his power. Curtis looked directly into Miller's eyes, his gaze cold and resolute, without a trace of fear or worry. He didn't rush to respond, only maintaining his silence as a test. Those observing began to realize the injustice in this confrontation. Curtis's unwavering stare met Miller's as if he were battling against the system that sought to impose its power on someone unafraid. Then Curtis spoke softly but clearly. "You're not the only one in this cafe with Power Officer Miller." Those words were a strong reminder not just to Miller but to everyone present. Curtis was not only facing a violent police officer, he was confronting a system that had always considered him an outsider, someone who never quite belonged in the space he occupied. Yet Curtis was not easily willing to give in. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, simply spoke calmly as if he wanted Miller to understand that power was not always about domination, but about respecting the basic principles of fairness. Curtis remained composed as though he knew this battle was not just between two men, but between values. Miller stood still for a moment, as though unable to believe what Curtis had just said. The entire cafe fell silent. No laughter, no whispers, just an all-encompassing quiet, as if everyone had stopped to witness a wordless struggle between injustice and resilience. The eyes of the people in the cafe were now fully focused on the two men. There was a shift in the atmosphere. The patrons had begun to realize that Curtis was not just a man trying to have a peaceful lunch. He was a symbol of perseverance, of someone who would not tolerate oppression, who would not remain silent when justice was being violated, and that for those witnessing it was an awakening. Some people began to turn on their phones, secret cameras flicking on, and the confrontation between Curtis and Miller had become an event that no one could ignore. The people in the cafe were no longer just customers. They had become witnesses, people watching this standoff, and perhaps the images they recorded would make everyone question the very values they lived by. While Miller, though not voicing it, could clearly feel his power shrinking, Curtis remained seated. Maintaining his calm, Curtis's demeanor wasn't just resistance, it was the strength to uphold the values he held dear: fairness, mutual respect, and most importantly, honesty. No one in the cafe spoke, but the exchanged glances. The looks of empathy and awareness began to spread. People had seen in Curtis not just an ordinary man, but a warrior, not on a battlefield, but in a greater battle, the fight for justice, respect, and the right to live with equality. As Miller lost control and began to make tense movements, the silence in the cafe felt like an invisible wall blocking his every move. The phones continued to record, each frame becoming more important. Each passing second could become an inseparable part of a larger story. A story of power, resistance, and change that we all need. There was no frenzy, no violent conflict, just an internal struggle unfolding in those moments between a calm man and a police chief who had long lived in the self-satisfaction of power. They didn't need to make this confrontation violent. The difference between these two men was their confrontation with justice and injustice. Strong but calmly astonishing. And so in the all-encompassing silence of the cafe, an invisible but powerful decision was made. Just a few minutes after the confrontation in the cafe ended, the phones had already transmitted every moment of that standoff across the world. The video clips from the cafe were quickly shared on social media platforms. Each time the video was uploaded, the view count skyrocketed, not only in Charleston but also spreading to cities large and small across the United States. Every moment of the confrontation was revisited by viewers. Curtis Langston stood firm, unafraid, unfazed, while Officer Miller clearly lost control. There were no shouts, no physical attacks, but the image of Curtis, unmoving, resilient in the face of threats, was more powerful than any words. The story had gone viral not just because of the confrontation between one man and one police officer, but because it evoked strong emotions in the public. Comments from viewers quickly flooded in. "The hero of calmness," one person wrote. "He stood up not just for himself, but for all those who have been disregarded and oppressed." Then another status: "I've never seen a confrontation that taught me more about the power of patience and dignity." In just a few hours, what seemed like a small incident, Curtis Langston became a symbol. Hashtags began to blossom. On Stand Tall, #Grace, Under Pressure, a Curtis Langston. Hero, the image of Curtis in his suit standing strong against Miller's aggression, became a symbol for a movement against power abuse and racial discrimination. Civil rights organizations, citizen advocacy groups, and prominent individuals within the community quickly spoke up. Discussions began to flood forums, TV programs, and social media. People began asking questions about what Curtis had gone through and what he truly represented. Never before had the issue of racial discrimination within the police system been raised with such intense attention. Protests soon erupted in major cities. Stand Tall, like Curtis Langston, became the rallying cry for those demanding justice and an end to discrimination. Banners began to appear with bold slogans: "No more power abuse. Calm is not weakness. It is true strength." These slogans were not just the voice of one individual, but of a community yearning for change. Under the growing attention, Curtis couldn't have imagined that he had become an integral part of this fight. He began receiving thousands of messages from strangers, from people thanking him for helping them restore their faith in justice. He read each message, each one filled with touching stories from people who had faced discrimination, those who couldn't speak out, or those who had endured irrational oppression in their everyday lives. Respect for Curtis grew. Reporters, social activists, and human rights organizations approached him for interviews and to hear his thoughts. But Curtis, the man who had dedicated his life to the military and never sought attention, declined all requests. He didn't come into this story to become famous, but to help the forgotten, those who had no voice. At this point, Curtis was no longer just the man eating lunch in the cafe. He had become a role model for many, an example of strength without violence, of patience that wasn't weakness, but a profound understanding of one's own power. He had taught the community a simple but profound lesson. Doing what's right isn't always easy, but it's the only way to change the world. Although Curtis's story had become a phenomenon on social media, in Charleston, real change had only just begun. The city was not just remembering a man who had stood up against a police officer abusing power. The city, and perhaps the entire nation, had begun to remember something much more important. Change must start with the individual, with every person willing to stand up when basic values are violated. With each video shared, each post made, people became more aware that Curtis Langston was not just a resilient man, but a symbol of a new movement taking root. A movement calling for justice, respect, and change in the way we treat each other, particularly within the legal and police systems. Curtis Langston's story was no longer just his own. It had become the story of an entire generation, a movement and an era. What happened in that cafe was not just a confrontation between one man and a police officer. It was a confrontation between power and justice, between oppression and truth. After the incident in the cafe, the wave of opposition from the community didn't stop at social media discussions. It began to take concrete action. Civil rights organizations, human rights activists, and those standing for justice all focused their efforts on investigating Officer Miller's behavior. The police chief who had abused his power against Curtis Langston, what had occurred was not just a small incident, but had sparked larger issues of racial discrimination in the way the police system operated. As soon as the video of Curtis and Miller's confrontation spread widely, civil rights organizations immediately began gathering evidence and investigating past instances of racial discrimination that Officer Miller may have committed. Stories from witnesses started to be collected, and Miller's past actions, suspicious incidents in arrests, and citizen dealings began to be brought to light. Investigative reporters and human rights organizations began seeking information on previous incidents involving Miller Police Force records. Internal documents and citizen complaint reports were gradually being revealed. Some past cases had been ignored or not properly investigated, where Miller was a key figure. Surveillance footage, recordings from emergency calls, and other evidence were gathered, painting a clearer picture of how the power in the hands of certain police officers had been abused over time. One report from an incident that occurred 3 years ago particularly caught attention. At that time, Officer Miller had used excessive force in the arrest of a group of black youths without clear reason. Witnesses to the incident reported that Miller had used coarse and violent language when approaching the subjects, even though they had shown no clear criminal behavior. The police force had chosen to ignore these reports, and the incident was eventually swept under the rug without proper investigation. Next, civil rights organizations began to gather more cases involving Miller, many of which showed clear signs of racial discrimination. This wasn't by chance, but part of a larger system where some police officers abused their power and continued their actions without facing punishment. Videos, testimonies, and other evidence gradually made Miller's image clearer than ever before. In Charleston, resistance was no longer just about protests. Human rights organizations and civil rights groups not only called for an investigation into Miller's actions, but also demanded comprehensive reform of the police system. These organizations, supported by local and national citizens, continued to push for change. They called for a thorough review of the police force and the implementation of specific measures to prevent the abuse of power. Meanwhile, Miller began to feel the increasing pressure from the community. Each passing day, he felt surrounded by tight scrutiny from the press, civil rights organizations, and the public. Despite strong reactions from him and his defense lawyers, all his justifications were no match for the evidence being gathered by investigators. The truth about Miller's actions could no longer be hidden. From witness testimonies to complaints filed by citizens, a clear pattern of racial discrimination emerged in Miller's actions. Previous incidents he was involved in, including unreasonable arrests and unnecessary assaults on black people, were confirmed. One witness in a past case publicly stated that Miller tended to approach black individuals with a discriminatory attitude simply because they appeared suspicious. Outrage from the community continued to grow. Protests spread not only throughout Charleston, but to other major cities as well. Tweets, Facebook posts, and videos were shared at an unprecedented rate, increasing pressure on authorities. Civil rights organizations demanded the creation of an independent oversight committee to review past cases and investigate the behavior of involved officers. At the same time, a series of surveys and studies were conducted on the extent of racial discrimination within the police force. The initial results showed that this was not just an isolated phenomenon, but a systemic issue within law enforcement agencies nationwide. These studies were published and became an important part of the campaign calling for reform. Under immense pressure, Charleston's authorities were eventually forced to open a formal investigation into Officer Miller's actions. All the evidence, testimonies, and videos had been gathered, creating a solid case for prosecution. The tension in Charleston no longer remained just a series of online discussions. It had transformed into a movement demanding justice and change within the police system. Miller, once a powerful police chief, now faced the inevitable consequences. The events of the past, the wrongdoings he had committed, were slowly being exposed, and no one could hide the truth any longer. The investigation was progressing, and soon everyone would see the results they had been waiting for. Would justice truly prevail? And would the police system really change after everything that had happened? Meanwhile, Curtis Langston maintained his calm. He didn't need to speak any further. He had done what was necessary. Curtis's actions were not only a reminder of the power of the people in the face of police power abuse, but also a significant step forward in dealing with long-standing issues in society. The incident in the cafe had changed many things, not only for Curtis Langston, but for the entire community. From a chance encounter between a man who had spent his life in battle and a police chief with an attitude of authority, Curtis's story had now become a symbol of the fight not just for personal justice, but for widespread reforms in the legal system, particularly within the police force. After the facts about Officer Miller's actions were exposed, Curtis and civil rights organizations continued their relentless efforts to push for reforms within the police force. This was not just his battle, but a battle for those who had been oppressed and discriminated against for many years. People began to realize that the important issue wasn't just holding one officer accountable, but changing the entire system so that no one would have to endure such power abuse again. First, Curtis and the civil rights organizations began to demand an independent oversight agency, one that was not directly controlled by the government or the police force, to oversee and evaluate police conduct, particularly in cases of arrests and violations of citizens' rights. They emphasized that an independent oversight agency was essential to protect the rights of the people, especially vulnerable groups like Black people and other minority communities. This was not a simple request, as changes to the police system touched on many fundamental issues of power and authority within law enforcement. But Curtis and the civil rights organizations did not back down. They fought to make this demand a part of the reform agenda, and the support from the community only increased the pressure on lawmakers and the government. One of the other key proposals was to require all citizen complaints about police conduct to be made public. Curtis argued that transparency in all police actions was essential to maintain public trust. He stressed that only when these reports were made public could the people monitor and verify the accuracy of cases involving police officers. Protests began to erupt everywhere from Charleston to other major cities across the country. Curtis never sought to become a public figure, but now he had become the face of a large movement demanding change. These protests were no longer just about opposing one officer's actions, but had turned into a struggle for more comprehensive reforms in both the police and government systems. They demanded that the authorities be held accountable and make tangible changes to prevent the abuse of power, like what had happened to Curtis and so many others before him. Civil rights organizations collaborated with politicians, lawyers, and influential figures within the community to bring these reforms to the agenda of congressional meetings. They were not only seeking legal changes, but also pushing for a change in the mentality of every police officer. They wanted officers not only to obey the law, but to understand that respecting human rights was essential to their work. Despite facing strong opposition from conservative factions within the police who felt their power was being threatened, Curtis and the civil rights organizations did not back down. They continued to fight, calling on the community to participate, urging everyone to stand up and speak out for the basic rights they deserved. Throughout this process, Curtis realized that the battle he was engaged in was not just for himself, but for a fairer future for everyone. He understood that change could not happen overnight, but every step, every struggle, and every person who stood up would contribute to building a solid foundation for the future. The people who stood with him, those who supported him from the very beginning, had now become an inseparable part of this fight. And that's why Curtis never felt alone. Reforms began to take place. An independent police oversight agency was established in several major cities. Citizen complaints about police conduct were made public and became part of the oversight process. Although these reforms had only just begun, they had created a powerful effect in the community, making many citizens feel safer when dealing with the police. Curtis realized that the struggle would never end until the system truly changed. But he also knew that it was the determination and courage of people like him that would drive change. The reforms he helped push for, though not complete, had opened up a new path, a path where people could walk together to protect the values of fairness and human rights. Thus, Curtis Langston's struggle and the work of civil rights organizations were not just about fighting for police reform, but about fighting for a brighter and fairer future for all. Their actions not only helped change part of society, but also created a powerful wave pushing back against racism and the abuse of power in society. Curtis Langston's life since the incident in the cafe had never returned to what it was before. While important progress had been made in the struggle, he still had to face stubborn conservative forces within the police force, those who didn't want to see their power threatened. But Curtis wasn't afraid. Every challenge he faced, every battle he entered, was an opportunity for him to reaffirm his ideals and his belief in a fairer future. Curtis was not alone in this fight. He had the support of his family, friends, civil rights organizations, and the community. However, like any real battle, resistance and forces against change were not easily defeated. Curtis and his family had to endure considerable pressure from those who wanted to protect an outdated system, one that was all too familiar with unjust power. For Curtis, these battles weren't just about personal justice. They were a revolution to change what had become normal in society. He had to fight not only with police officers, but also with government officials, those who saw power as their top priority. They resisted the reforms proposed by Curtis in the civil rights organizations, not for any other reason than fear of losing the control and power they had held for years. In the following days, large protests erupted across cities, drawing thousands of people. They spoke out for reforms, demanding transparency in every action of the police force and respect for citizens' rights. Slogans like "Police are not kings," or "We want justice, not domination," echoed through the streets, from poor neighborhoods to wealthy commercial districts. What was noteworthy was that these protests were no longer just simple resistance. They had become a true revolution. Curtis realized that this fight was not just for him or his family. It was for all those who had suffered from racial discrimination and the abuse of power. Curtis had become the leader of a movement where he was not alone, but a part of millions of people sharing the same ideals. The support from the community grew stronger. Those who had once stood silently on the sidelines now stood up. Those who had once been afraid now had the courage to fight. Civil rights organizations also continued to ramp up pressure on the government and police forces. They not only demanded legal reforms, but also demanded a change in how the police interacted with the community, especially with minority communities. Curtis's confrontation was not only about police reform, but a bigger fight. This was a battle for human rights, for justice for all people, regardless of race or social class. Curtis, with his perseverance and vision, had made everyone realize that small changes could lead to great transformations in society. Although Curtis's struggle and the community's efforts had achieved some initial victories, he understood that this was just the beginning. Police reforms were gradually being implemented, but significant challenges remained. The conservatives within the police force and government were not willing to concede easily, and they continued to obstruct change. But with each protest, each act of resistance, each struggle, Curtis became more confident in the cause he had chosen. The community, with the support of civil rights organizations, had united to create a power that could not be pushed back. The reforms began to be implemented, and Curtis and his allies' tireless efforts had gradually created a noticeable change in how power and justice were viewed in society. The progress in this struggle wasn't just a change within the police force, but a change in the mentality of every citizen. Curtis had inspired those around him, making them realize that this fight was not a solitary battle. It was the fight of the entire community, the fight to reclaim power for those who were oppressed and harmed. Everyone could be a part of this change, and Curtis was the one who had lit the flame of hope. All that Curtis and his family had faced had overcome great challenges, but nothing could stop the strength of unity and the desire for justice. The community under Curtis's leadership had become an unstoppable force, although significant progress had been made in reforming the police system. Curtis Langston understood that his fight was just beginning. The changes, though monumental, were merely the first bricks in a building of justice that he and the community were constructing. The police system couldn't change overnight, and the conservatives within the force, those who always sought to protect their power, would not easily accept these changes. Curtis knew his work was far from over, and he had no intention of stopping. Since the incident in the cafe, Curtis had become a symbol of resilience and inner strength. The community increasingly placed their trust in him, but at the same time, there were many who felt uneasy about the changes he was pushing for. These were the people in power within the system, those who had lived comfortably in the safety of unjust structures, and they weren't about to easily accept the changes Curtis was bringing. Although reforms had started to be implemented, Curtis knew that facing change in the police system would never be easy. However, what made Curtis strong wasn't the support of the crowd, but his unwavering belief in what he was doing. He had lived a life full of challenges, from the hardships of military service to standing firm in the most tense situations. But for Curtis, what mattered more than anything was the righteousness of his cause. He knew that these changes would not only benefit him and his family, but they would have a profound impact on future generations, creating a fairer society. While the support from the community was growing stronger, new opponents began to emerge, not just from the police force, but also from those holding power in politics. Some politicians began to fear that the changes Curtis was pushing for could disrupt long-standing interests. They worried that these reforms would alter the power structures they had built over the years. Conservatives began speaking out against the movement, doing everything they could to prevent the transformation that Curtis was leading. However, Curtis didn't let this shake his resolve. He knew these challenges were not unexpected. He had faced difficulties before, and now he would continue to face these new challenges with determination. This was something Curtis had learned throughout his military career. No battle is easy, and change never happens without resistance. He continued to work with civil rights organizations and allies to push for reforms. They were fighting not only to change policies, but also to change how the police interacted with the community. They demanded an independent oversight system, the public release of complaint reports, and called on politicians to not turn a blind eye to acts of power abuse. The community stood firm with Curtis, and the shift in society had begun to become clearer than ever before. Every step Curtis took, no matter how difficult, was met with strong support from organizations and citizens. The protests grew stronger, not only protesting power abuse, but also demanding real change in the justice system. The conservatives continued to find ways to delay these changes, but Curtis never gave up. He knew that change wouldn't come immediately, and sometimes great sacrifices were needed to achieve the goal. But every time he saw the perseverance of the community and the strength of those standing with him, Curtis became more confident that this fight would ultimately succeed. With every step he took, Curtis wasn't just fighting for his own justice, but for a new generation, one that would not submit to injustice. He knew that no matter the difficulties and challenges he faced, in the end, truth and justice would prevail. And although this battle wasn't over, Curtis had already shown that change always starts with small actions from ordinary people who dare to stand up for what is right. He knew that society would change, and that was the reason he continued on this difficult journey. Curtis Langston was not just a man who had lived a life full of challenges. He had now become a living symbol for the oppressed. Curtis's story wasn't just about one individual standing up to injustice. It was the story of a larger movement, a revolution he had sparked, where everyone could find the strength to change a system that had existed for too long. From a simple confrontation in a cafe, Curtis had not only defended his own rights, but also ignited the flame of justice in the hearts of millions of others. Curtis's journey became a symbol not because he sought attention, but because he lived by values that many people around the world were still searching for: courage, resilience, and above all, respect for the basic rights that every human being deserves. Those who had followed Curtis's story from the beginning realized that he wasn't just fighting for his own rights, but for all those who had been overlooked and discriminated against, for those who had never had a chance to speak up. Curtis's story didn't just attract attention because of his confrontation with the police chief or the actions surrounding it. It created a huge wave in the community, sparking a change that resonated globally. Curtis's image, with his steadfast gaze and calm demeanor in the face of power's threat, became a symbol of the movement against racism and the abuse of power. The images and videos of him from the cafe were shared across social media platforms, not just in the US, but around the world. And every time people saw that image, they saw a symbol of strength and perseverance in the fight for justice. What was important was that Curtis wasn't just a hero in this story. He was an inspiration, a driving force for those who felt they weren't strong enough to stand up. He didn't fight just for himself, but for the communities, for the people whose lives were being violated and whose basic rights were being eroded. Those who had once felt pushed into the shadows by society now saw a glimmer of hope in Curtis's story. It all started with Curtis simply wanting a peaceful lunch, but in the end, he had become the leader of a revolution in a society in desperate need of change. The protests grew larger, not only in Charleston, but across the nation, with people from all walks of life joining together to demand true justice. Civil rights organizations, political action groups, and individuals seeking change had gathered around Curtis, not because they wanted him to be the leader of a movement, but because they saw integrity and resilience in him that they had never seen in anyone else. Curtis wasn't a hero from an action movie or a leader of a grand struggle from the outset. He was just a man, an ordinary citizen, but with determination and courage, he had suddenly become a symbol for the movement. His story was no longer a personal story. It was a fight for a community where people no longer feared standing up for their rights. Curtis hadn't just changed how the people around him saw things, but also how society as a whole viewed major issues such as racism, power, and justice. Curtis's image throughout his journey had become a model that millions of people wanted to follow. His story had created a shift in how we perceive fairness and power in society. Curtis had not only confronted those with power, but he had also confronted an entire system. And throughout this journey, he taught everyone an important lesson. Resilience isn't about beating your opponent. It's about standing firm in what you believe, even when everyone around you is stepping back. Day by day, Curtis Langston was no longer just a man in a smart suit sitting in a cafe. He had become an integral part of the larger story of society, a story that no one could turn away from and ignore. Curtis's story wasn't just about him, but about all of us, the people in this society, those seeking real change. And as the storms of the battle continue to rage, Curtis will always be the beacon guiding us toward a more just and free society, where everyone, no matter who they are, has the right to be respected and live in peace. This part of the story, like a dramatic conclusion, closes the chapter of Curtis's journey, but opens a new one in his long fight and in all of ours. Thus, Curtis Langston's story is not just about a man standing up to oppression. It is a reminder to all of us. When you choose to stand up, you don't just change your own life, you change the world. And remember, whenever you think things can't change, there is someone like Curtis ready to step in and prove to the world that every injustice can be overturned. Never forget that power doesn't come from force, but from calm and faith in justice. So are you ready to stand up for what you believe in? If this story makes you think about how you can change the world, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful and inspiring stories. We will continue to bring you lessons about strength, courage, and the big changes you never expected. Subscribe to the channel and become part of this movement. Together, we will change everything.